Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healers specialize in websites for counselors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counselors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Hi, I'm Rory and welcome to episode 319 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Our guest today is Susie Jamieson, a BACP accredited psychotherapist, EFT practitioner, coach and trainer, just to name a few of her qualifications. In the first part of this two-part interview, Susie takes us behind the scenes of both the emotional and procedural journey involved in being on the receiving end of a complaint as a therapist. She shares her personal experiences of navigating a complaint, providing valuable insights into the complexities and challenges that can arise in such situations. Be sure to tune in for the conclusion of Susie's story in part 2, airing in episode 320 or 320 on November the 30th, 2024. And with that said, over to you, Ken.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for counsellors, psychotherapists, and counselling students. Here are your hosts, Rory Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello and welcome to episode 319 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Both myself, Ken Kelly, and Rory Oakes are delighted to welcome you, and we've got three exciting topics, starting off with ethical sustainable practice, where today we continue our discussion on neurodivergence, and we're going to be speaking today about understanding the double empathy problem in neurodivergent therapy. We then go on to practice matters. That's the CPD section of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Rory has already introduced our guest, who will be speaking about navigating client complaints, and this is part 1 of a two-parter. It's really informative and well worth the listen. And then we move on to our student services, where we recognize you, our students, on your journey, your formal journey to become a counsellor, a psychotherapist. And today we're going to be speaking about developing your internal supervisor, which, Rory, I know is a great topic for our qualified colleagues as well. It's something we work on through the arc of our practice. But let's start off with that ethical, sustainable practice, where we're looking at understanding the double empathy problem in neurodivergent therapy. What is, Rory, the double empathy problem?
Well, it was a concept introduced by Dr. Damien Milton in 2012. And it basically states that when we engage with neurodivergent individuals, we can have communication challenges. So it might be that the understanding of a neurotypical person is markedly different to that of a neurodivergent person. So if a good example of that would be, you may say to somebody, a neurodivergent person, can you pass the salt? And they go, yes, and don't pass it to you because they think that you're speaking about their ability to give you the salt pot, not the underlying question, which is, please give me the salt pot. So we can find that maybe things like simile and metaphor may be a bit of a challenge for those who are neurodivergent because it might not be clear enough. It might not be easy for someone to interpret what's being said. I think that the salt's a good example, or or maybe, you're invited in at the end of an evening and your partner says, do you want to come in for a coffee? And you stood there and you're saying, where's the coffee? As opposed to being a metaphor maybe for something else, for sex. So I think when we work with clients, what we have to be very thoughtful of is being really clear in our communication and making sure that what we say is understandable to the other. But we cannot rely on shortcuts in our syntax, because they may be misinterpreted.
Yes, lovely, beautiful introduction. Thank you, Rory. And I certainly see myself falling under this double empathy problem within my home life. My wife is neurodivergent as well, very different to me, and very often we'll have a discussion. We can talk for some time and have a in-depth discussion, and the interesting thing is we can both leave having had two separate discussions because of the way that our frame of reference wrapped around the topic or subject that we were talking about. We find it actually funny, and then there are other times when it can actually cause a challenge, when there was an expectation that wasn't carried out either way because of a misunderstanding. And that's what it boils down to. It boils down to misunderstandings, and this is what we're trying to eliminate as much as we can within a therapeutic session. If we're opening our doors and saying that we are happy to invite in a neurodivergent client, then we need to learn what are the barriers of communication. And I think that the double empathy problem falls beautifully into a barrier of communication. So it is a misunderstanding. It is, to simplify it, I would put it into two separate frames of reference. And I love how you use pass the salt there, Rory. Can you pass the salt? Yes, I can. I have the ability to pass the salt. Well, then will you give it to me, please? Oh, here it is. And then that person might be quite irritated. I asked you to pass me the salt. And the neurodivergent individual might say, no, you didn't. You asked if I could pass the salt. And I answered you, yes, I can. And therein is a misunderstanding over getting some salt on your dinner, Rory. It happens.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
We would steer away from things like I see you've put all your eggs in one basket, or you're juggling a lot at the moment. It could be interpreted literally. Well, I don't know how to juggle. Why are you talking about eggs when I'm talking about the things that I'm planning in my life at the moment? So we want to be recognizing that there is a double empathy problem. And I think of it as two circles. So if a full circle is one person's complete frame of reference, what they're trying to communicate with the other person all lives within one circle, and the other person has their own separate circle. And what we might hope for in an everyday conversation is that there would be enough of an overlap of the two circles to create a segment of shared understanding. When we're speaking about the double empathy problem, we're speaking about the circles almost staying completely apart, where there isn't a shared understanding. But each of the two parties believe that they are putting over the information in the correct way, or receiving the information in the correct way. So an example of that, I'm going to just use almost a pass the salt one. My wife might be out on her way to work and say, would you be able to put the bins out today? And I might say, yes. And then she might come in that evening and say, well, did you put the bins out? And I say, no, but you didn't tell me to. You just asked if I could, and of course I can. I had the time. You should have asked if you'd have wanted that. I don't know if this is just a very cunning excuse that I'm coming up with. It's just a made-up example of double empathy problem. And I guess, Rory, when we look at this, there is oppression and psycho-emotional harm that can arise from this. And I think this is the important point that we should maybe look at now.
Yes, I mean, the thing is, we shouldn't be forcing or helping, in inverted commas, our clients to be neurotypical. They are who they are. They have their own frame of reference, and I think this term psycho-emotional disablement was highlighted by Damien Milton's co-writer of the paper that they published, a person who identified themselves as light. And it effectively, historically, those people who are neurodivergent were taught to be neurotypical. They were, and if there was ever a case, and I'm using a metaphor that might be tricky for someone who's neurodivergent, so putting a square peg in a round hole, that might cause some neurodivergent people a bit of confusion. That's it. You're trying to make people fit into a rigid framework of neurotypical thinking, when in fact they think in a very unique way, and they have every right to think in that way. It's up to us as therapists to be mindful of our communication and make sure that we're communicating really clearly. We've talked before in the podcast, Ken, when we're working with children, we use what's called clean language. In other words, language that can't be misinterpreted. And I think the same idea here is really important. We use language that would be very difficult to be interpreted differently. So you've used the example, can you put the bins out? And if you're in a therapy session, you might say to a client, do you want to take a seat? That could be confusing, couldn't it? Well, where do I take the seat to? You could just say to them, if you want to sit on that seat. And this is a conversation I have with my grandson on a regular basis who's autistic. You have to be very, very precise with what you say to him, or he just doesn't understand, or it becomes confusing in the world.
Yeah, so we're looking to reduce ambiguity here, to make things crystal clear. And another area where we may experience double empathy problem, a neurodivergent individual may not be able to read social cues that are given off maybe with an eye movements or facial expressions. So I'm going to take an example where a neurodivergent individual may have an area of interest that they really find absolutely fascinating and can speak for hours and hours on it. If they were speaking about their special interest to a person, and that person was maybe bored and trying to show with their body language that they've had enough of this talk now, it may be difficult for that neurodivergent individual to see that, to recognize that, unless the person specifically said, you know what, this is really great, thank you very much for sharing so much, but that's kind of as much as I can absorb right now. Can we leave it there? The neurodivergent individual would then probably say, oh, okay, yes, that's fine, but they wouldn't be able to read the social cue. Again, it's double empathy problem. One person may be feeling uncomfortable in a situation, the other person not realizing that, being passionate about what they're talking about and continuing to talk about that. So there's another area. So neurodivergent individuals generally will appreciate honesty and simplicity in what is being asked, And one of the things where I see this happen quite a lot with myself is that I worked for some time in sales, and I was on the road a lot, and people would give me directions. Oh my goodness, the double empathy problems and challenges I had with directions. You get to the you get to the bottom of the road, and then you just turn up when you see the red the red post box. What is up? What go up the road, go down the road. I want a carry on T junction left. Carry on for half a mile right is easier for me than kind of how it might be explained and how it was explained to me. I used to just go to a map book, and this was before the years of with the little box that sits in your car that takes you where you want to go. Oh my goodness, I'm getting old, Rory.
Yes. The old using the roundabout as a clock analogy. So you come in at 6 o'clock and you go out at 3 o'clock.
Yes,
always was very helpful for me. I have to say that's how I give directions for roundabouts. Come in at 6 and go out at 12. It's really straightforward for me.
Yes, and another place where we see double empathy, and a double empathy problem doesn't just restricts itself to a neurodivergent, neurotypical conversation. Of course, we're applying this theory here, but we see it often within a working environment where a task might be set for a certain person. When that task comes for delivery, and the person has maybe done it incorrectly or hasn't done it at all. And then only then is the discussion had of, but you didn't say you needed it that way and this way and that way. And only then does it come out what the real understanding was. Now, with barriers to communication, we are looking to reduce those as much as we can within counseling and psychotherapy. When that client is in front of us, if that person just happens to be neurodivergent, we need to be mindful of how we speak, not to use metaphor, maybe not to use simile, and maybe you can, speak to the individual, see how they feel about that, and regularly check your understanding of what they are saying, but also their understanding of how you are reflecting back and what you are adding as the therapist within the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it comes to being curious, doesn't it? I think therapists should be curious. And I think one of the biggest challenge with clear communication is that certainly in the person-centered tradition, there is an idea that we should only use questions to clarify things. And I think if we're working with neurodivergent clients, and we understand that we may have to be very accurate in what we're asking, we may have to adapt our questioning style to some extent, and use what's called Socratic questions. So what would happen if, or very, very direct questions. A Socratic question is effectively a question you know the answer to, but what you're doing is you're asking that person if they know the answer to it. So I guess the Socratic question would be, what would happen if you didn't get this job? And that the person may respond and say, well, I would look for something else. It's not something we do usually in person-centered therapy, but I think we might have to adapt, certainly in the person-centered world, our questioning style to make sure we're getting across that clear communication and that we're both where we can be on the same page. You're never going to get those two circles that you beautifully described, Ken, aligning, but we could get them to a point where we can communicate effectively.
Yeah, and it's the recognition, as we've said before, if you've met one autistic individual,
Yes.
You've met one autistic individual, and everybody is going to come as they are. And it's about us being curious, like you say, Rory, checking regularly with our clients, asking the client to be part of creating how we work. Maybe we've been working in a certain way for many years. Now, if we're looking to train in welcoming a neurodivergent individual into our practice, we have to look outside of that. We have to adapt our communication and our approaches. We have to evaluate the modality that we were using. You were just speaking now, Rory, about being purely person-centered, where we might use questions very sparingly. It may be that we need to adapt. Is this appropriate for the client that I'm working with? And we need to do some critical thinking, I guess, as practitioners. We need to build that empathy. How do we do that? Well, we do it through curiosity, through really caring about what that person is sharing with us, where they're coming from, and understanding how they communicate. And I guess as final thoughts, the double empathy problem reminds counselors and psychotherapists that empathy is a mutual endeavor that requires flexibility, curiosity, and a commitment to seeing beyond neurotypical norms. So we're actually growing a little bit outside of the norms. And as therapists, embracing the bi-directional empathy enables us to create a supportive environment for neurodivergent clients. And this is a beautiful sum up of the final thoughts that we have on the handout that is available. And Rory, I couldn't reference this handout without mentioning what you mentioned in our last podcast. If I say to the neurodivergent individual, oh, I've got a bat in my car, I'm just going to go and get the bat out of my car. Well, what does that person think? Now, do they think it's a cricket bat? Do they think it's a baseball bat? Do they think it's a small animal in a box that I have in my car? I'm being ambiguous. I know exactly what I mean. I'm going to go and get the cricket bat out of my car and put it behind my door. But there in itself just shows how tricky the double empathy problem can be, and how it requires us to do some thinking. So if you want the handout, the super duper handout, and the link to the in-depth article called Understanding the Double Empathy Problem in Neurodivergent Therapy, you can do so by going to counsellingtutor.com. That is the place to visit. Click on the podcast tab, do a search, and find yourself at episode 319. And right there on that page, the link to the super duper handout and to an in-depth article on understanding the double empathy problem. Any thoughts or final words on that, Rory?
Yes, I think that we use so much shortcuts in language. I do it all the time. I use metaphor and simile all the time. And I think sometimes we do it without thinking, because our communications kind of forged like that from a very, very early age. And I think this is thinking. I think that when we are using language, it's always good, not just with neurodivergent clients, but any client, to think about how clear our language is. And maybe that's an area of personal development, one that could be discussed with your supervisor. How often do you use kind of little linguistic shortcuts in the hope the other person knows? And sometimes it can be confusing for neurotypical people. So think about how we communicate, and just think how clear our communication is. Think clean language, as we would do if we were talking with children.
If you're interested in doing some deep CPD, some training, Counselling Tutor does have a training course built by Rory and myself with input from other neurodivergent counsellors and individuals. It's been peer reviewed as well. Go and have a look. It's at counsellingtutor.com. Click on our products tab and you will be able to find that course right there for you. And that was Ethical Sustainable Practice. We move out of ethical sustainable practice into practice matters, where today, Rory, a very interesting topic, and I think that everyone's going to want to hear this. This is about navigating client complaints. Rory, tell us more what we can expect from Susie.
Well, in a first for the Counselling Tutor podcast, this is a two-part interview. And in the first part, Susie Jamieson will be telling us about her experience of navigating the complaints process and what happened. And in part two, which is in podcast episode 320 or 320, she'll be telling us the conclusion of this real cliffhanging story. So I caught up with Susie, and this is her story on navigating the complaints process.
Practice Matters is proudly sponsored by the Counsellor CPD Library. To access top quality, relevant continuing professional development for your practice that you can do at a time that suits you, and all for less than the price of a cup of coffee, visit counsellingtutor.com.
We've talked about complaints on the podcast before, and in fact, we've had the opinion of ethical bodies who've talked about the complaints procedure. What we've not had is someone who's come on to speak about what it's like to have a complaint levelled against them, and also to get to some understanding of, I'm guessing, the level of stress it brings, but also of the mechanics of having to deal with a complaint and what that looks like from the practitioner's point of view. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Susie Jamieson, who's very courageously, in my opinion, come on today to talk about what it's like to have a complaint levied against you, and also the mechanisms that are generated once a complaint's made. So Susie, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Rory, for having me. It's a pleasure to be able to speak openly about being complained about. Not something counsellors are particularly willing to do. We tend to hide in shameful isolation under rocks when this happens to us, but somebody had to speak out, and it seems that person is me.
Well, we thank you for that. So, first of all, do you want to talk us around the build up to the complaints, or maybe how you first heard about the complaint? What what happened, if you could speak in maybe abstract tones about that, because obviously client confidentiality is paramount here, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think the therapist's experience of a complaint is always kind of absent of the complainant themselves. However, to answer your question, there generally isn't really a build-up. You just get an email in your inbox which just says, "Dear Ms. Jamieson, we've received a complaint against you." And the word against is, in my humble opinion, very confrontational and opposing word. And it places the therapist and the complainant into an arena of opposition. No one wants to lose. So it's a shock, a huge shock.
Yes, and I think that's very interesting, because I think when people think of complaints, people might think there's an event that's happened or something that's happened that may lead to that. So I give an abstract example. Maybe maybe a client has taken offence to something that's been said, and they've stormed out of or walked out angrily, which does happen during therapy when people are having to look at themselves. And you think, oh, that could be a complaint. But it seems like in your case, it was totally unexpected. It was one of those kind of 3:30 events on a Tuesday afternoon when you just fired your email up and all of a sudden this dropped into your box. It sounds like it was a complete surprise.
It was and it wasn't. And unfortunately, I'm not able to explain the part that wasn't a surprise. Okay. However, time had passed. The BACP, through no fault of their own, just due to the checks and assessments that have to be done by the professional conduct procedure, I wasn't alerted for 4 months from the date the complaint landed. And this is commonplace. So, yes, at the time it came in, oh my goodness, it was like Halley's Comet hitting me. It really was.
Yes. And as you say, the language is... I guess it sounds confrontational, even if I guess I'm playing devil's advocate because the BACP are here to defend themselves. But I guess that they would say they had a procedure to alert people, but it does, as I say, sound as you said, sound confrontational. So this landed. So what happens next? You get this email. So what happens after that?
So what happens after that is you are invited to do a preliminary response. You don't actually have to do one, but it does help if you do. And you can say as much or as little as you want to. My personal strategy was to tell my membership body everything. I answered every piece of the complaint in detail with evidence. And this is why your notes are so important, why your supervision notes are so important, why your relationship with your supervisor is so important. And we'll get onto insurance later, I'm sure. But you put together a document full of the evidence that you need to demonstrate that you have been ethical, professional, you've made use of all the resources that you're supposed to make use of. And in my case, I'd been to the Ethics Hub 4 times as well. And just to put this into perspective, it took me in excess of 150 hours to put my preliminary response together. It's a lot of time investment.
Yes.
Especially when it's not factored into what you're doing in your business at that time.
Yes, because this is quite disruptive, isn't it? This needs attention, and obviously you've got other things going on for you. You're running a business. I think people sometimes forget that therapists run businesses. They've got bills to pay, and they have other clients to work with and to see. So that 150 hours seems quite a lot, to be honest. When I think of 150 hours, that's a huge amount of time, isn't it?
It's huge, absolutely huge. Fortunately, the email landed in my inbox just as I'd finished work for 2 weeks. I wasn't going on holiday, but I'd won this place on a marketing course, a beta version, and it was the most incredible opportunity. It got kiboshed. I made it to day 2. I had to bail out. never got my money back, never get that opportunity again. So that was the first casualty, really, of being complained about. There were many more.
Now, how long does the complaints procedure take? Is there a statute of limitations on that initial response that you're asked to give?
There is a timeline. There is a lot of deadlines that are requested of you at various points in the process. And when you do your preliminary response, I believe it's 21 days. Can't remember off the top of my head. But the BACP, and I'm sure UKCP and all the other membership bodies do the same, they produce a timeline. But if you go through the timeline and you add up the time for each stage, we are looking at, I think, something up to 35 months. If the case goes all the way to a hearing and is then appealed.
Good grief.
It can be a long time. No, it's definitely not weeks. It's many, many weeks. Yes, it's well over 2 years. My particular timeline was 20 months from the date of complaint to the date of the final decision. And I was engaged in the professional conduct procedure for 16 of those months. Like I said, the first 4 months I didn't know I'd been complained about.
Good grief. Good grief. So I guess my other question is that membership bodies, and you mentioned the BACP specifically, but I think it's useful to remind anyone listening that I would think that all professional bodies who sit under the professional standards umbrella, the PSA,
absolutely,
certainly here in the UK, so that would be UKCP, that would be NCPS, Association of Christian Counsellors, Human Givens. I think there's 13 and I can't remember them all. But anybody who sits under that umbrella would probably have, I would imagine, the same service level agreement, because they have to meet that level to satisfy the professional standards authority that hold the accredited register. So do you think that the membership body in question met the timeline, met their service level agreements on this?
They did. They actually did.
Right.
When you're on the outside looking in, my gosh, it feels like they don't, because you wait and you wait and you wait and you wait. But when I did a comparison of the various stages, yeah, it pretty much met the timeline published. So,
what you spoke about how your complaint came in. You're going on holiday. You were taking leave from your business, but you weren't actually going away. What would have happened if you'd have just gone away on holiday? Say you were travelling for a month, and got back to find the email in your inbox. What happens if you'd missed those deadlines that professional bodies set?
I would hope that I had an email provider that allowed me to do an out-of-office reply. I used to have one of those. I currently don't. I dread to think. I really don't know, because it may be considered that you were not conforming or not complying. But I think if you could prove that you were on holiday and that you weren't reading your emails, I'm sure that they would say, okay, well, you've now got your X number of days to get the response to us.
So I think there's a takeaway right there, isn't there? How many of us go on leave and never put our autoresponder on? I'm raising my hand here. So if you are a private practitioner, if you are going away on leave, put your autoresponder on, and say when you'll be back, and that acts as evidence that the email's received, and also it clearly states that you're away on holiday. Everybody deserves a break, or it might not even be a break. You may be away for a medical procedure or on bereavement leave, or there could be any number of reasons why you can't respond to an email. But as long as, I guess, the professional body can see that the email has been received and that there's a reason for non-response, that might go into some form of mitigation that you've not responded within the time. So you send the info. First of all, you get the email. That's a real shock. Then you send the information back after doing all this work, 150 hours of work. You put it in, as I expect, as an attachment to an email. You press the email button. You see it fly off into the internet. And then you wait. What's that waiting like?
Indescribable. Indescribable. I think it will depend on the therapist, the complaint, the complainant, the circumstances, personal situations. There's a lot of factors to take into consideration. But there was something very uncomfortable for me about the whole process. And yeah, this is where it gets very difficult to directly answer a question. But trust me when I say I had some very serious concerns. And they took a huge toll on my health, my mental, physical, and emotional well-being. And yeah, sleepless nights. My hair was starting to fall out. I was overeating because I come from a background of disordered eating, and I'd got my disordered eating under control, and then something like this happens, and yeah, I was eating and eating and eating. I took myself away a few months later just to have a few days respite with yoga and some friends, but I just couldn't contain the magnitude of shame, fear and rage that I had built up inside me. And that's when I got notice from the BACP to tell me the complaint was going to the next step. And I couldn't understand how that could be. I'd given them absolutely everything. You know, I wrote a 38-page, 10,000-word document as my defense. And I'm very good at doing things like that as well. But it clearly wasn't enough. Either that or the particular stage that the complaint process had got to, reading my documentation hadn't yet come into play. But I didn't know that. So I made an assumption that they didn't believe me. And I hit very hard and I collapsed.
So I just want to be clear about that. You're not saying that you weren't believed. It was an assumption based on the process. Yes. Yeah. And I think I have to, as I say, the BACP aren't here to respond, but I think in good journalistic tendencies, just to really clarify that. Let's talk about support. We've heard, the traumatic reaction that I sense from right from the initial email, right to the email or the response you got where you say it's going to the next level, even after submitting the your evidence. Where did you go for support? You talked about yoga, but I guess professionally, where did you reach out to? And let's look at that first.
Glad you've asked that question, Rory, because this brings up another unexpected response. Fortunately, I'm also a coach and I have some amazing coaching friends, and they were my primary source of support. And I really mean my primary source of support. I looked for therapists for a long, long time, and I just couldn't find somebody either who got me or was willing to take me on. So I was without a therapist for about 18 months. But like I say, I have professional friends and they were incredible. I also have an amazing supervisor.
So in finding personal therapy to process the personal side of this, just separating the professional side, the personal side of this, was it difficult to find a therapist because when you talked about what the presenting issue was, they shied away from it? Or was it more of the fact that you couldn't find someone, you mentioned the word who kind of got you. Was it one or the other, or a mixture of the two?
Oh, an absolute mixture. But when you're in the state that you can actually get into when you're going through the professional conduct process, you overreact. Things don't make the kind of sense to you that they would ordinarily without the tumultuous pressure that you're under.
spoke about coaching. How about other professional avenues such as supervision?
My supervisor was incredible. We worked very closely to check my fitness for practice. You know, you have to be so careful about showing up for work when we've got this huge emotional thing going on in the background of our life. And I spent a lot of time between April 2021 and September 2022 dipping in and out of work.
So, something of this magnitude, and certainly hearing your story, it must have impacted on your ability to carry on practicing. There must, or should I say, was there some fallout into that? Did you have to make some decisions about how you managed your practice with this? And I guess, what were those? What kind of decisions did you have to make?
I had to put my self-care first, limit the number of sessions I could do in a day, which was, sometimes down to just one, have long gaps between them, make sure that my self-care was well scheduled into my day, and have extra supervision to make sure that I was coping with my client work and scheduling time off. Now, because I don't tend to see clients weekly, that's just the way I work, it's the way my practice is, it was very easy to make that quite fluid. So people didn't really notice my days off, my maybe a whole week off, my afternoons in bed. It was all done in the background. So I juggled and I managed, I think, incredibly well. But even so, a lot of time away from working. And obviously, as a sole income, a huge amount of money was lost.
Yes. So having to reset your practice or your business, and I call it a business because it as I always say, it buys the tea bags and puts bread on the table. An impact to self. In terms of your supervision, how was that helpful for you? What areas did your supervisor support you in?
All areas you could even think about. So we looked at the emotional toll on me. We looked at my fitness for practice. We looked at my casework. We looked at my caseload. We looked at the change in the way that I was responding within myself to client work. I was worrying about everything and second guessing everything. And my supervisor would bring me back to the here and now, to the reality of my track record. I'd been a successful therapist for 9 years before this happened, and reminded me of my qualities and my abilities and all those soft skills that I have as a therapist, and helped me to look through the window I needed to look through, but also there was another window to also look through. She was incredibly supportive.
And I guess, finally, when we look at our support system, we have people don't really think of insurance. I pay for my insurance every year. And I just pay for it, have a look through the terms, and it goes into my folder and it stays there. But once the complaint's activated, you have to tell your insurance company.
You do. Yes.
And can you speak to what that process is when you email them or phone them up or however you contact them and say, I've had a complaint levied against me?
Okay, this is another rather controversial story, so I'm actually not going to tell it. I've presented this at the BACP private practice. So what I will say is, when you get complained about, call your supervisor, call your insurance company, call your therapist. Just do those three things. But anybody listening today, please, please, please go and check your insurance policy and make sure that you have cover for legal expenses in the case of malpractice. It's not the same as public liability or professional indemnity. cover for legal expenses, and that will give you access to a...
Yes, so it's not unusual for people who've been complained about to maybe have spent some time with a legal expert or someone who is versed in law or versed in complaints procedures, how organisations manage and I'll use the word execute. It seems an apt word to use. Execute complaints procedures. So did you have access to a professional who you could
Absolutely.
talk to? Yeah. Tell us a little bit about that.
So the solicitor that was appointed to me had 25 years of knowledge and experience helping therapists with complaints. The cover that your insurance companies give to you is more than adequate. It really is. And the solicitor is the only person in the whole process that can give you advice. For example, there is a point in the process that's called consensual disposal. And it goes along the lines of something like this. You apologise in writing to the complainant and basically admit that you're sorry for their experience. And if they agree to accept that, that's called consensual disposal. You get a little sanction maybe, and the case is closed. And that's what I wanted to go for, because I just wanted this whole nightmare to come to an end. And my solicitor said, absolutely not, because you've just spent 150 hours and 38 pages saying that you didn't do this, and et cetera, et cetera. Why would you now want to change your mind? I said, well, I don't really understand what consensual disposal is. He said, well, basically, you're admitting you did wrong and you're offering an apology. He said, but here's the thing. The complainant doesn't accept it, you'll find yourself in a hearing trying to backtrack on what you've said. So when you read the consensual disposal document, for me, it was quite hard to read all the documents at the time because you're in such a state of shock when a complaint comes in. You've got 74 pages of documentation to read. It's a lot to take in, and I just couldn't take it all in. So I made a dangerous assumption.
And that was?
That I would go for consensual disposal.
I think this interview's been really fascinating, and for the first time, I think, ever on the Counselling Tutor Podcast, we're going to do a part 2. So we're going to do a part 2 because it is in-depth, and your experience is so profound that I think the people who are listening to this would want to hear more. So for the time being, Susie Jamieson, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and I'm sorry that the podcast isn't 20 hours long because there's a lot to say.
Well, we'll be putting out the part 2, and people can pick up in the next part where we will be talking about things like the right to appeal, what a sanction looks like, maybe a little bit about your view on the whole process, and maybe how things that you may wish were different. But thank you so much, and again, thank you for your courage, because I don't think I've met anybody who's had a complaint against them who has ever wished to publicly discuss it. So I think you're doing a great service. So thank you again.
Massive thank you to Susie Jamieson, and to you, Rory, for reaching out and keeping us in suspense as we sit at the edge of this cliff, looking forward to episode 2. I feel like I'm watching a soap opera now because I want to know what happens next. They always do that, don't they? They get to the exciting bit and then they just leave you right there. So make sure you join us next week for episode 320 to hear the conclusion of Susie's story. So now on to Student Services, where we recognise you, the students, on your formal journey to become counsellors and psychotherapists. Student Services is sponsored by Counselling Skills Academy. Can't tell you how many times Rory and I have heard counselling students say that learning skills and knowing that they're using them effectively is really, really challenging. The reason for this is because we don't get to see another counsellor using skills in a real live session. In reality, this means that we're asked to learn something that we can never see demonstrated in a real setting. And it's no wonder that many of us are left feeling unsure. If you want to see counselling skills used in real sessions by qualified therapists, so this is real sessions, real presentations, and real use of skills, then go to counselingskillsacademy.com. There's some free videos on skills, including a full live session that you can have a look at. Gain the competence and the confidence of knowing you're using your counselling skills effectively. Just visit counselingskillsacademy.com. And today in Student Services, developing your internal supervisor, Rory.
Yes, it's an interesting phrase, isn't it? And it comes from a psychoanalyst called Patrick Casement, who wrote a book on learning from the patient. It was quite a groundbreaking book because it talked about, I guess, the beginnings of supervision and also the fact that we can learn from our clients. I know it's used the term patient, but we can learn from our clients. And the internal supervisor is something that one develops as you move through your practice years. So if you're doing a diploma in counselling, in your second year, you usually have a placement, and you're not going to have a supervisor on tap. And what happens is you kind of develop an internal supervisor. You've learned the ethical issues. You've probably done class work around ethical problems and how to work an ethical problem out. And what happens is you interject that, and you become, to some extent, your own supervisor, although you still have to see a supervisor, just make that clear. But you're developing a kind of therapeutic wisdom which allows you to operate in two spaces at a time. I sometimes used to refer to it as helicoptering. So you're in the client's frame of reference, but you're also sat to one side, listening to the encounter, and you're thinking about maybe other aspects of the client, or maybe where you have to be very thoughtful ethically about the client. So a good example of that would be you're working with a client and they disclose that they have suicidal feelings. What would happen with an experienced therapist is that, yes, they'd be in the moment with the client, but part of them would be working through what they may need to do as the session moves on, and as the client's intentions become clearer. And that is developing the internal supervisor. It's giving you a skill set to be able to manage the client work and manage the operational part of the client work, as well as being in the frame of reference. I think there's probably going to be a lot of people who are listening to this thinking, I don't know how that works. But I'm sure there are going to be people who are in practice who go, I know exactly what you mean, Rory. And it is literally as kind of separate as that. Because what happens is it just kicks in one day. One day you'll be sitting in your practice, working with a client, and all of a sudden you'll see this kind of helicopter. You'll be looking at the interaction as well as being into it. It's a very difficult process to describe, but once you've experienced it, you really do know what it is, Ken.
Yes, very much so. I love how you've described it, and you're 100% right. It kind of turns on one day, and I believe it lives in the area of unconscious competence. Now, I'm going to describe that. We've said this a few times on the podcast before. So when we start off with, as a student, we go into our skills sessions, we might be thinking, now, what is the right skill to use in response to what this client is saying? I wonder how that skill landed. And we're really questioning what we're doing when we're doing it. But as we mature and we go out and we're in placement and we're seeing a number of clients, we eventually are no longer thinking, how should I respond to that? We're almost doing that unconsciously. The competence is set in. We are consciously competent. And we always put this to driving a car. When if you ever drove a stick shift car or a gear driven car, think about the first time you might have tried that, and it's almost impossible. You've got to remember so many things, and the clutch and the gears, and the same is true when we go into practice. We've got to hold that client, we've got to keep them safe, we've got to actively listen, we've got to think about how we are presenting ourselves within the therapy room, be on every word they're saying, looking for the emotions behind the words. So much going on, and we are consciously incompetent when we start off, but we become consciously competent. Once we are consciously competent, then there is that ability to kind of almost be separate from self within the session. There's a separate part of self that just sits slightly outside, and that is our internal supervisor. It watches down on the process. So even though we are there 100% with that client, as soon as the client says something that kind of raises a bit of a flag for us, and that might be, as you've said, Rory, might be regarding the contract we have with them, it might be regarding the ethical guidelines, it might be something to do with legislation. A little flag goes. Notice I do all my own sound effects in the podcast these days.
How does it go? How does it go, Ken?
And it weighs, and you kind of see it there, and it might be something you go, oh, I got to think about that afterwards. I got to put that in my notes afterwards, or it might be something you need to speak to the client about there and then. So this might be cognitive. So cognitive meaning it's in our cognition, it's in our mind, it's in the way we're thinking. But of course, as we mature further, as we become more mature practitioners, then you get intuitive information. So a client may not have said something, but you get an intuition, you get a feeling that this client may be holding something back, there may be an area that they don't want to go into or something like that. And we learn to trust that intuition, and it may change how we respond to that client. We may delve, we may lead, we may welcome where our intuition is leading us. And then, of course, there is somatic information, the feelings that we get within the session with this client. So there are many layers to this, and I think this is why when we kind of put this topic out at the beginning of this podcast, Rory, I was saying, yes, this is in student services for you, our students, but I think that this is a really good resonant topic for our qualified practitioners as well. I wonder where you find yourself if you're a qualified practitioner. Are you now, you most certainly will be in that unconscious competence. Are you past the cognitive supervisor and working within that intuitive and that somatic way with your clients?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's a really good way of putting it, and I think it speaks to observing the process. So, yes. I think sometimes when you're really into the work, you can lose sight of actually what else is going on because you're so focused on what the person's saying. And I think a good example here is transference. So, you may come to the end of a session, and as a student, and you may think to yourself, I don't really like this client. The client goes and you make another appointment, and you think, I'll have to take that to supervision. Someone who's got an internal supervisor may work out as the session progresses, oh gosh, this person reminds me of a former partner that I had, and it didn't end very well. And that's where this feeling's coming from. And then in that moment you go, well, that isn't that person from the past. This is someone brand new that I'm seeing. This isn't that they are not the same person. And I think that sums up the internal supervisor, the ability to be able to, in the session, to be able to work out your own process and adjust your reactions to the client as that unfolds. Because obviously, if you have transference, the danger is you're going to close down. You're going to close down because you're going to be working with those feelings, and sometimes it can be really uncomfortable. Contrary, you might think, "Oh, I love this client," and I'd love this client, and you could become over kind of gushy with the client, if you like. So, really important that once you develop this internal supervisor, it gives you an even keel to work on, and you can identify the process, and more to the point, your process or the client's process. What's going on for the client in this moment? in the relationship between you and them, because it's multi-layered therapy. It's, yes, we're listening and we're reflecting back and we're communicating, but there's other dynamics in place, such as how does the client see me? How am I feeling about the client? Those are the things that the internal supervisor will tune into. And I give you another example. Talking many years ago to a female client, and I just got the sense there was just an underlying sense of fear in the voice. And I said to her, I said, I wonder how it feels talking to a man about the difficulties you had. And she said to me, it's not easy. And I said, just can you tell me more about that? And she said, yeah, because all the men I've met have been really horrible to me. And we moved on to a different conversation about who I was to her, and I wasn't those men. And that was a really curative part of the therapy.
Yeah.
Because in that moment, she could see that I wasn't every man she'd met. I was another man who wasn't a threat to her and never be a threat to her. And everything from that session onward changed. She came in, she walked in differently. But that was the internal supervisor. That was a hunch that came up. So I was in the work, listening and then there was another part of me hovering over, like in the helicopter, thinking there's a withdrawal by the client. And there'll be people listening to this thinking, I've got no idea how this works. But one day, I guarantee you'll be sitting in front of a client and you'll go, oh my goodness, that is the self-supervisor, that is the helicopter. It just literally clicks in, and it does speak to unconscious competence, conscious competence. It speaks to that kind of journey about learning your craft.
Oh, yeah. And that example that you've just shared with us, and thank you for sharing that, Rory, it falls well and truly into that intuitive information. It's something that was not said. It was a felt sense. Maybe you picked it up in their voice. Maybe it was just something that you were picking up internally. But when you checked that out, so first and foremostly, what you did within that situation is you trusted that intuitive feeling. You trusted your own intuition. And I guess the world is kind of built in a way where we're told to just trust what we can see, feel, smell, taste. Yeah. But intuition, it is a part of who we are. And there is a maturity in accepting that intuition. You didn't just rush in there and go, I've got a feeling that something's off here. You went in and you tested it out. You gave an invite for that client to give more information. They gave more information, which showed that it was valid to feel that intuition, and it had a positive outcome for that client. And I guess when we act on that intuition, sometimes we're told that is called immediacy. If we look at skills, immediacy is like an intuition that you may bring forward, something that's happening in you, but it is also part of that internal supervisor, that watching and seeing. And then when we go to somatic, maybe the client has left. The client has gone, you're done, you're doing your notes, but you've got a knot in the pit of your stomach and you don't know where it came from. Why am I feeling this? Trusting your body, having a look at it. Who was this client? Maybe there is something that is playing out that is unseen between you and that client. Maybe there is transference. And it's worth going and saying, when you go to your supervisor, saying, when this client had left, I couldn't help but notice each week when they leave, I'm left with a knot in my stomach. I wonder what that is. Work with your supervisor on that. That internal supervisor, I think, is a really interesting area of development. I think it's something that you work on throughout the arc of your practice. I think that the more mature you are in your practice, if you are paying attention to it, listening to that intuition, really feeling what plays out within you internally within your body. And of course, we keep up our CPD so that we're able to be there for the cognition part of this, any cognitive information that may come up. We're doing that just in service of our clients, but there's an immense personal growth to it as well in trusting our intuition and looking at the somatic feelings that may come up with us within our sessions, Rory.
I agree, and I think I know you're the person really who's got an in-depth knowledge of skills, Ken. But I wonder what your thoughts are on this. I think that the development of the self-supervisor and mastering the skill of immediacy come pretty much at the same time, and usually when someone's started on their practice work, when they're in practice. I think immediacy and developing a self-supervisor, they really are connected, because immediacy is the conduit of how the self-supervisor can enact within a therapy session. So thinking about me speaking with a female client, I used immediacy there, but it was the self-supervisor that kind of said, there's something going on here, Rory. Let's just check this out. And immediacy allowed me to bring that question, a tentative question, and the whole relationship changed. I think the two things are pretty linked. I'd welcome your view on it, Ken.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's kind of, as you were speaking, that's why I put them together. I'd be interested if there was any peers listening to this have seen any research on that they can share with us, because I'd certainly like to deep dive into that. Immediacy is a topic that comes up often amongst students, saying, what is it? How do I do it? Because immediacy, you're acting in a way that may not come from the client. Well, the truth is, it always comes from the client in some way, shape, or form. It's something that comes up in us because of how the client may have acted, the tone of their voice. We may not always be cognitive or conscious conscious of what and why, but something comes up in us. We feel that we need to put that out, and we put it out, and when it hits, it's incredibly powerful. And I agree with you, Rory. I think it really plays into that internal supervisor. It's a part of self that we are able to access that is just very difficult to put in words. And I struggle with that kind of stuff. But even Carl Rogers mentioned, towards the end of his writing, he was saying there's a side to this that is not that tangible, that I can't write down in words, that it's almost, intuition is one of those things. You can't measure intuition. You can't smell it, see it, hear it. It's a felt sense inside that is even difficult to put in words of what you felt inside. And we learn to better understand our intuition within ourselves as we journal, as we maybe take time to reflect on our own personal development. I think that's where it lives. And that is today's student services. And we're so grateful that you joined us for episode 319 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. The National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society, or NCPS, proudly sponsor this podcast, supporting students every step of the way. Join the NCPS for resources, training, and a friendly, knowledgeable community to enhance your learning experience. Visit ncps.com.
Thank you so much for joining us. We started with ethical and sustainable practice, understanding the double empathy problem. Ken and myself took a deep dive into what the double empathy problem was and gave some tangible examples of how we can navigate what double empathy is and the problems that it can bring. In Practice Matters, we had a first of a two-part interview with Susie Jamieson, who talks about navigating her experience of being complained about. This is one to share with your peers. This is one to share on your social medias so that everybody can benefit from Susie's courage and wisdom on this. And don't forget, part 2, the concluding part of this interview, will be in episode 320. And then in student services, we had a little look at developing your internal supervisor, what they may look like, and the benefits of working with it. And finally, I'd like to thank all those people who leave us super comments and friendly observations on social media platforms, and in particular on the iTunes platform or the podcast platforms where our podcast is hosted. So if you want to leave a comment, leave an observation, we always look for the feedback. We always like your observations. So, clickety-click or scrollety-scroll and pop them on when you've heard this podcast. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode by visiting counsellingtutor.com.